2 days after Third Army stopped a 3-day river crossing plan, an engineer team came back from the Luxembourg riverbank with a blunt conclusion. The ground at the second crossing point was waterlogged, soft, and unable to support the vehicles the plan called for. The person who had warned them was not an engineer. He was a 20-year-old private who had been sitting against the wall, taking notes, and the reason he knew the bank was dangerous had nothing to do with military training. He had watched that stretch of river misbehave since childhood. To understand why that mattered, go back to the briefing room. December 1944. Third Army was pushing toward the German border. Staff officers had spent 3 days building a detailed crossing plan. By the time the operations officer reached the second crossing point, the briefing had been underway for about 20 minutes. Private James Foley was not there to contribute to the plan. He was there to record it. He had been at Third Army headquarters for 6 weeks, assigned to administrative support. He had no combat experience and no formal training in operational planning. In a room full of senior officers, he had almost no reason to expect anyone to ask what he thought. But Foley had something the planning process did not. He knew the river. His assignment itself made the omission sharper. Foley's knowledge of local language and terrain had been noted in his personnel file when he joined the headquarters. That was one reason he was useful in administrative support. But the planning section had not consulted that qualification while preparing the crossing. The headquarters knew, on paper, that Foley knew the area. The information had simply never been connected to this particular decision. He had been born and raised in a small town in Luxembourg near the German border. His father was American, a veteran of the First World War who had remained in Europe and married a local woman. Foley grew up bilingual. As a boy, he learned the nearby river the way people learn places they use repeatedly, not as a blue line on paper, but as ground that changed with rain, seasons, soil, and approach. He had spent 2 summers walking that section with his father. He remembered where water collected. He remembered which banks stayed firm. And he remembered one approach where farm equipment could bog down after the autumn rains. That was the approach now appearing in front of him as a military crossing point. The planning section was working from aerial photographs taken in September. The crossing would happen in December. The photographs were not false. They were simply old enough to hide the condition that mattered. As Foley watched from the wall, he recognized the landmarks. He noticed the drainage shadows. Then the operations officer explained how vehicles would move through the second crossing point, assuming a firm bank capable of carrying their weight. Foley stopped writing. He raised his hand. The briefing continued. Nobody acknowledged him. He kept his hand up until the operations officer paused between sections. Then Foley spoke without waiting to be recognized. He said the plan would fail at the second crossing point. For a moment, the problem was no longer the river. It was the room. A private had just interrupted a senior staff briefing and challenged part of a plan that officers had spent 3 days preparing. Before anyone could shut him down, Patton raised his hand and stopped the operations officer. Then he told Foley to come to the map. Foley crossed the room while the officers watched. Patton did not ask him for a theory. He asked him 3 questions. First, where specifically would the plan fail? Foley pointed to the second crossing point. The plan treated the bank there as stable enough for vehicles. Foley said that in December the bank held water from the autumn rains. The soil in that section contained clay and drained badly. Heavy vehicles, he warned, could sink before they ever reached the crossing. His evidence was not a field manual. He had seen farm equipment get stuck there when he was a boy. Second, how could he be certain the conditions he remembered still applied? This was the moment when Foley could have tried to sound more confident than he was. He did the opposite. He said he was not entirely certain. The aerial photographs showed drainage patterns that matched what he remembered, which suggested the underlying ground had not changed. But memory was not enough to prove the bank's current condition. Someone needed to go look. That answer mattered. Foley was not asking the room to replace professional planning with childhood recollection. He was pointing to a specific uncertainty that the existing information could not settle. Patton asked the third question. Was there another crossing point? Foley studied the map and indicated a point about a mile upstream. He remembered higher ground there, better drainage, and more gravel in the soil. During wet periods, he had seen vehicles use that approach when the lower bank could not be trusted. Patton looked at the map. Then he halted the briefing. He ordered the engineer officer to send a team to inspect both locations. Further planning would wait until the current bank conditions were verified. 3 days of staff work had just been paused because a private had noticed that a September picture was being used to answer a December question. Foley returned to his place against the wall. He resumed taking notes. He did not make another speech. He did not suddenly become part of the planning staff. He finished the stenographic record and spent the next several days unsure what the interruption had done to his standing at headquarters. That afternoon, his administrative sergeant stopped him in a corridor and asked what had happened. Foley explained the bank, the drainage, the stuck farm equipment, and the upstream alternative. The sergeant listened, nodded once, and walked on. Foley was left to guess whether the silence meant approval, disapproval, or simply that nobody had a ready category for what had happened. Meanwhile, the only question that mattered was being tested outside the building. 2 days later, the engineer team reported back. The second crossing point was waterlogged and soft. The clay-heavy bank had retained the autumn rainfall. Its condition had deteriorated since the September aerial photographs were taken, and it would not support vehicles of the weight specified in the plan. The photographs had accurately shown September. They had not guaranteed December. The team also checked the upstream point Foley had identified. That bank was firm, better drained, and adequate for the planned vehicle weights. The staff revised the crossing plan. The change cost another day of planning because approach routes and timing had to be adjusted. But several days later, the crossing was carried out successfully without the vehicle losses the original bank condition could have caused. That would have been enough to justify listening to Foley. A later account by Patton's aide emphasized the same point from another angle. Foley's value was not that he possessed some mysterious instinct. It was the physical specificity of what he knew. Soil that held water, a drainage pattern visible in the photographs, a remembered failure of farm equipment, and a nearby approach that behaved differently in wet weather. Those were details a map could not supply by itself. The aide's account also made clear that Patton had not canceled the plan because he trusted a private more than his staff. He paused because Foley had identified a claim that could be checked, and because checking it before committing vehicles was cheaper than discovering the truth during the crossing. But the more important consequence happened inside the headquarters. Major Lawrence Holt, the operations officer whose briefing had been interrupted, later described being irritated when Foley first spoke. The irritation lasted only until he realized that the interruption contained a specific testable claim. While the engineer team was in the field, Holt reconsidered how his planning section gathered terrain information. The weakness was not that officers lacked maps. It was that the headquarters had no structured way to collect what soldiers and local people already knew from direct experience. Foley's own personnel file had noted his knowledge of the local language and terrain. He had been in the headquarters for 6 weeks. The information existed inside the organization before the planning problem appeared. No one had thought to ask for it. Holt changed the process. The successful crossing did not turn Foley into a planner. He went back to the same administrative work. That matters because the story did not end by correcting the rank structure. It corrected one decision, then exposed a gap in how the headquarters gathered information. The practical change was smaller than a reorganization, but larger than a complement. People carrying direct terrain knowledge now had a route into the planning process before the maps became orders. According to the source account, the adjustment required no new resources and no formal directive. It created an informal channel for information carried by soldiers returning from forward positions and by people with local knowledge. Holt later said that this became useful more than once before the campaign ended. That is what turned one interruption into more than a lucky correction. The engineer report verified a bank. The headquarters changed how it listened. There was a limit to the lesson, and Patton's response showed it. He did not accept Foley's memory as final authority. He did not throw away engineering judgment. He did not order the crossing moved simply because a private sounded convincing. He stopped long enough to test the claim. That distinction is the center of the story. The danger was not rank itself. Armies need hierarchy. The danger was allowing hierarchy to decide which facts were worth checking. Foley had information the planners did not have. The planners had the authority and technical resources to verify it. The useful result came from connecting those two things before vehicles reached the riverbank. There was no dramatic medal ceremony afterward. Foley received no formal commendation specifically citing the briefing incident. About 6 weeks later, he was promoted from private to private first class in a routine personnel action that included several soldiers from his administrative unit. The promotion carried no notation tying it to the crossing plan. After the war, Foley returned to the United States. He used the GI Bill to study civil engineering and spent roughly 4 decades working in infrastructure and waterway management. eventually focusing on river engineering, flood control, bank stabilization, and crossing assessments. Years later, when he spoke briefly about his wartime service, he did not frame that morning as a story about a young soldier being braver than a room full of officers. The later interview also fits the way he had behaved in the room. Foley did not claim certainty when he did not have it. He separated what he remembered from what the photographs suggested, and separated both from what only an engineer team on the ground could confirm. His contribution was not being right by instinct. It was knowing enough to identify the question that still had to be answered. He remembered it as the moment he understood what it meant to know something the people making the decision did not know. And Patton's response had shown him something equally important. Useful information does not become useful merely because someone possesses it. It has to reach the decision while the decision can still change. For 6 weeks, that terrain knowledge sat inside 3rd Army headquarters in the mind of a private assigned to administrative support. Then, in the middle of a briefing, the photographs reached the wrong season, the plan reached the wrong bank, and Foley reached for the only authority he actually had. He set down his pencil.